Jason Kiss. 2.1 Steps Forward.
Thanks, Stuart. Thanks, everyone, for coming along. Right, so expectations, those are powerful things, right? And often rather dangerous. So I'm going to set some right now. I'm not so sure we're going to get through all of the new in WCAG 2.1 in the next 25 minutes, but we'll do our best. So, of course, when I started 15 years ago, we had WCAG 1.0. Some of you may remember that. It was interesting because it actually had all these passages like until user agents support this or that feature, you can't do this or that. Or it was also very technology focused. So it actually called out specific technologies, HTML, JavaScript, and said use these kinds of elements or aspects or methods. And then in 2008, we got WCAG 2.0. And of course that changed. It became technology agnostic. It provided us with testable success criteria, or what we call, which are effectively requirements in WCAG. And again, it was technology agnostic, so it didn't really specify particular technologies, but instead outcomes and testable outcomes. And we get success criteria or requirements in the form of this example here, 1.4.4 resize text. Except for captions and images of text, text can be resized without assistive technology up to 200% without loss of content or functionality. So it's a testable requirement. We can measure against this requirement whether a web page passes or fails, ostensibly. There's lots of gray, of course, as you know in WCAG. So 61 success criteria, 61 requirements, and these are split among three what we call conformance levels. Level A, level AA, level AAA. WCAG 2 forms the basis for a wide variety of web standards and even legislation in different countries. So for example, Australia, Canada, the EU, India, Italy, Japan, New Zealand, United States, and I put the UK in there for obvious reasons as a separate nation. And so depending on the country, in some cases it's actual legislation. WCAG 2 is there embedded in legislation. In some cases it's government web standards that WCAG 2 forms the basis for. So as Lainey mentioned this morning, accessibility in a sense is really international. But you will note that WCAG 2 came out in 2008, and so a lot has changed. What we recognized shortly after WCAG 2 was published was a number of gaps in there, particularly around touch interface, or what we often just refer to as mobile. But of course, mobile and touch interface aren't synonymous anymore. We have touch-based laptops, touch-based desktop-sized monitors, touch-based kiosks, all sorts of touch-based interfaces. So I prefer to talk about touch as opposed to mobile, but we're also considering small screen interactions with WCAG. And that was a gap. Low vision users have a bunch of requirements that weren't very well captured in WCAG 2 or addressed. And then as well, the largest demographic in disability, cognitive, intellectual, reading, learning disabilities, very hard to tackle. And effectively, except for one AAA requirement in WCAG 2, there's really nothing in there to support directly people with those kinds of disabilities. And so, 10 years later, we've got WCAG 2.1, launched in June. It introduces 17 new success criteria, 5 at level A, 7 at level AA, and another 5 at level AAA. So that's 12 new success criteria for level AA conformance, which is really all that anybody aims for. And I have there's a little aside about conformance levels and the difference between WCAG 1 and WCAG 2, and WCAG 2.1, which continues carries on with that same definition of conformance level, which isn't nearly as robust as it was in WCAG 1. If we get time, we could go back to that, but we won't discuss it now. And similarly, along those same lines, level AAA, we don't generally aim for that. I've got, 20 minutes now, so we're not even going to talk about those 5 level AAA success criteria, although one might argue that some of these improve accessibility so robustly for so many people that they should arguably be at a lower conformance level, even level A, if not just level AA. But again, we're not really going to go into detail about those. So jumping right in, let's start with 134, orientation. Content does not restrict its view and operation to a single display orientation, such as portrait or landscape, unless a specific display orientation is essential. And examples where a particular display orientation may be essential are a bank check, a piano application, slides for a projector or television, or virtual reality content where binary display orientation is not applicable. This is a AA success criterion. So this one's pretty straightforward. We'll move right through it. Of course, portrait landscape, if you just consider your phone, all this means is that your web page, when you move from a portrait to a landscape orientation with your device, the page should also change orientation. Pretty straightforward. In fact, if you get this for free, you have to actually make changes. You have to actively break that accessibility. So just don't do anything to address that, and you'll be fine. 135, identify input purpose. Oh, I should go back. I mentioned why is this one important in particular. So a use case, for example, if you're in a wheelchair and you have a tablet firmly attached to your wheelchair, in landscape mode, because that's what you find is most useful for you, and then the website is locked in portrait mode, that means you're going to be getting a crick in your neck trying to interact with this web page. So there's one example of why that's an important success criterion. 135, identify input purpose, another AA success criterion. The purpose of each input field collecting information about the user can be programmatically determined when the input field serves a purpose identified in the input purposes for user interface components section, so plain English throughout, and the content is implemented using technologies with support for identifying the expected meaning for form input data. So what the heck does this mean? Most of you will have filled out forms in your browser, and your browser will, you will have noted, suggests some autofill, some values for those typical form fields. So here's a screenshot of Chrome suggesting some values to input into some common form fields like first name, last name, street address, and whatnot. Chrome and the other browsers that are doing this, for the most part, they're using heuristics to figure out what this or that particular field is expecting in terms of a value, what's it trying to capture. And so it's not always going to be spot on, and you may have experienced that yourself where you say autofill and all of a sudden address lines aren't in the right space, or they've got their name wrong, or something like that. But that's the idea behind 135. But to make sure that we can robustly programmatically determine the purpose of each individual form field collecting personal information, we need to do something additional at the code level. So this right now on the screen is a list of all the different input purposes for UI components that we need to address and ensure are programmatically determinable when we create a form field that's collecting any one of these types of information. So they include things like name, given name, additional name, family name, password, new password, current password, organization, country, postal code, CC name, credit card name, for example, right? Or CC number, credit card number, birthday, language, a whole variety of these personal bits of information that we all have. And the way to do that right now, in fact, basically the only way to do that right now is to use the HTML autocomplete attribute. So here I have an example of two form fields. One has a label of surname, and surname, we might think, we know that means family name, but that's one of the types of personal information that we need to make sure can be programmatically determined when we have an input requesting that. And the way we do that is just by using the autocomplete attribute there. Autocomplete equals family name. That's the token from that list of tokens. And then we have credit card number. You do the same thing. Autocomplete equals CC-number. And then that programmatically identifies those form fields as requesting those types of information, right? And therefore, you can rely on your browser getting the right information into those form fields. But it's also to help people with intellectual disabilities. You might have a plugin whereby it will put up little icons next to different form fields based on that programmatic identification of what that field is intending to collect, right? So here I have an example. We have surname, a field for surname, and then next to it is a small icon, just rather arbitrarily designed by me, suggesting family name. Right? And then same thing with a credit card. We have a little icon of a credit card next to the credit card number field. So that might help an individual with language processing issues more clearly and reliably identify what they're supposed to put in there. If you still want more on 135, there's this unbelievable thread in the WebAIM mail list. Really, if you do drink, you should drink while you're reading this. It's very long, but there's lots to learn in there. There's a lot of really valuable insights on what programmatically determined means versus programmatically associated versus programmatically identifiable, and the whole purpose and intention behind 135. So go ahead and take a look at that. It's thread 8864. 1410, reflow. Content can be presented without loss of information or functionality, and without requiring scrolling in 2 dimensions for vertical scrolling content at a width equivalent to 320 CSS pixels, or horizontal scrolling content at a height equivalent to 256 CSS pixels, except for parts of the content which require 2-dimensional layout for usage or meaning. So again, what does this mean? Don't be distracted by the maths. Really what this means is that if you are viewing a web page and you zoom in, that page, the content should zoom with it, but not require you to scroll horizontally. That's in a vertical scrolling environment, so a typical environment. If we look at this website, for example, if we assume that this is 1280 pixels wide, right? If I zoom in 4 times, 400%, and there we go. That's an equivalent of 320 CSS pixels, right? 1280 divided by 4. But you can see I have to scroll horizontally now in order to interact with this site. So getting any comprehension just diminishes really rapidly when you're trying to read text or understand content and you have to scroll horizontally, right? Here's an example of one that works properly. They paid for me to come over. See, so no horizontal scrolling, everything is right in there, and I have it nicely laid out, and we have a lot of big faces. So that one's pretty straightforward again, right? 1411, non-text contrast, another AA. The visual presentation of the following have a contrast ratio of at least 3:1 against adjacent colors, and we think adjacent, just think surrounding, around. User interface components, visual information required to identify user interface components and states, and graphical objects, parts of graphics required to understand the content. These things need to have contrast ratios of 3:1. And of course, you know, in WCAG 2.0, we have 143, contrast minimum, which says text and images of text have to have a contrast ratio of 4.5 against their background. But until now, we'd never had a way to say that those important graphical components or icons and things like buttons, interactive elements, must also have a baseline contrast ratio. So we have that now, which is great. So for example, in the top here, we have a button. That button doesn't have any other indicators other than just the text of the word button. And so that text of the button obviously has to have a 4.5:1 contrast ratio under the old WCAG 2 success criterion. But as an interactive component, it also has to have 3:1, but we automatically meet that, of course, if we have the higher ratio of 4.5. But to the right of it is just an outline of its focus state. That focus state indicator effectively also needs to have a 3:1 contrast ratio, so it stands out. In fact, oddly, this is a WCAG 2.1 example, and that outline at my last calculation only had a contrast ratio of 2.8:1, so that's a fail. Below that we have a line graph. Each line is a different color, and of course, you know, we don't rely on color alone, and we add these little different individual shapes to each line so that we have an additional way besides color to distinguish between each line in the graph. And here we have all of these lines against their surrounding colors, which is effectively white, having a contrast ratio of at least 3:1, with the exception of one of the colors. Does anyone just tell, looking at it, which of the colors is not up to spec. The green, well done. Yep, so that is slightly less than 3.1. And then for important graphical objects, like this example here, where we have a bunch of custom icons for different social media, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter. These are pastel colors, some hot pastel colors, and then the icon within those pastel colors, which are identified just by white in the shape of the typical icon for that social media, just does not meet our contrast requirements. They're hard to see for everyone, in fact. And so in order to distinguish them, we have to put a different colored outline around the whole graphical item itself to distinguish it from the surrounding area. But as well, in order to make sure that what that icon is about is identifiable, we have to additionally use a different darker color on the bits of the graphic which identify what it's for. So for example, the F in the Facebook icon needs to stand out with a different contrast. So again, pretty straightforward, but now we can tackle those. Rapidly running out of time. 1.4.1.2 text spacing. In content implemented using markup languages that support the following text style properties, no loss of content or functionality occurs by setting all of the following and by changing no other style property. So line height or line spacing needs to be increasable to 1.5 times the font size. Spacing following paragraphs needs to be increasable to at least 2.2 times the font size, letter spacing to at least 0.12 times the font size, and word spacing. So how on earth are we going to test this one, right? This is for people with low vision generally who need, they have requirements which require them to modify those spacings, font size, font type even, but the spacing around letters, around words, around paragraphs. Handily, there is this text spacing bookmarklet. There's a few of them out there, but this one is by Steve Faulkner, and it enables us, it's just a bookmark. So if we, for example, let's go to the program page because it's got more text. And we just run this bookmarklet. It's got text spacing, so I'll just run it. And it automatically, you will have seen, applies all of those CSS changes. So the spacing between letters is now increased, the spacing between words are increased, the line height, as well as the spacing between paragraphs. And then we just look through the page then, right? So this is one of the easiest ones to test. We just look through, oops, I'm very sorry. We just look through the page and we look for content that is no longer, legible or something's overlapping something else. In this case, we've got success. So that's good. So that one's, again, pretty simple to do. 1.4.1.3, content on hover or focus. This one's a little bit trickier. When receiving and then removing pointer, hover, or keyboard focus, where receiving and then removing pointer, hover, or keyboard focus triggers additional content to become visible and then hidden. So think tooltips when you hover over something. The following are true. They're dismissible. We can dismiss it without having to move our pointer, hover, or our focus. They're hoverable. If hover triggers the content, the pointer can be moved over it without disappearing. And persistent, the content stays visible until it's no longer needed or the trigger is removed. So here's an example. And again, this is, again, for low vision, particularly users with who are using screen magnification. So here's just an example of some tooltips. Great. I can mouse over them and they show up. I can tab to them and they show up. But if I zoom in a screen magnifier and I hover over the first one, I can see that there's a tooltip there. So I'm just going to move over to read it. It disappears every time I move off the button that triggers it. So I have basically no access to that tooltip, right? So that's a fail in that regard. You'll notice I can tab to them and it shows up. I can hit escape and it disappears. Right? So again, I don't have to move my pointer, I don't have to move focus, it just works. But what we're looking for is more this kind of experience where I can zoom in and I can hover over something that presents a tooltip, and then I can hover over the tooltip and I can actually read the entire tooltip. So that's one of the important intents of that success criterion. Yes, exactly. So, note that only covers custom tooltips, submenus, and other non-modal pop-ups, not the HTML title attribute, which browsers themselves render. 2.1.4 character key shortcuts. Basically, if you have single, I'm going to start paraphrasing. If you have single key shortcuts that do things in your web application, there's a way for users to turn those off or to remap them, right? This is for keyboard-only users who have dexterity challenges and are prone to accidentally hitting keys, right? So if you accidentally hit a key that had a command associated with it, you didn't intend for that to be executed, or speech recognition users to avoid accidentally firing batches of commands at once. So here's an example from WCAG's understanding documents for this success criterion. You have a webmail application that has single key keyboard shortcuts, K navigates, Y archives, and M mutes messages in your webmail application. Someone enters into the room and says, "Hey, Kim," and the speech user's microphone picks that up and translates that into 3 different characters. Y, so it archives the current message you're viewing. K moves down one conversation, and M mutes a whole messenger thread, all without you doing anything at all, just someone walked in and greeted you, right? 251, pointer gestures. So if you've got pointer gestures, multi-point or path-based, so pointer, think of your finger or a mouse. So for example, swiping is a gesture, right? It's path-dependent. You got to go from left to right or right to left, up or down. If you have functionality that uses those kinds of gestures, you have to provide some kind of alternative that doesn't require a path-based gesture. Multi-point, think pinch to zoom on a map or something like that. You need to provide a way so that someone could zoom in on the map hitting a button, just a single pointer activation, instead of requiring these more complex path-based or multi-point gestures. Pointer cancellation. For functionality that can be operated using a single pointer, at least one of the following is true. We don't need to go into those details, but again, click events, pointer events are simplified. There are 2. When you press down, there's the down event, and then when you release, there's the up event, right? So with a mouse pointer or a finger, when you press down, that's the down event, but that doesn't activate by default the thing you're trying to do. It's once you raise your finger or you release the mouse click, right? So how do we normally get out of that? For example, I've got navigation arrows down here on the right. I've got no mouse cursor. So you've all known this. You've accidentally pressed a button and you say, "Oh crap, I didn't actually want to do that." You just move your finger or your mouse off of it and then release, right? And then you thereby avoid it. So that's the simplest way to do that. 253, label and name. This is labels and names. Accessible names, labels, you have a visual label on a form field. Sighted users say, well, that's obviously the label for that form field. But that form field might have its own programmatically assigned accessible name. And you have to make sure that if you give something an accessible name, that whatever visual label is provided appears in that accessible name. And there's a great video, Eric Wright in YouTube has a great example of using speech recognition of why this is critical. And I invite you to go and look at that. 254, motion actuation. Functionality that can be operated by device motion or user motion can also be operated by user interface components. So if you've got a phone, often you'll know, I get this all the time, I accidentally shake my phone and it says undo typing on my iPhone, and that's just because I shook it. So that's one way you can actually call up an undo function in your iPhone by shaking it. But if you have tremors or conversely, if someone has implemented that kind of maybe you're a photo viewing application, you tilt the phone left, it'll swipe to the previous photo, and then you tilt your phone to the right, it swipes the other way, or it goes to the next photo. If you can't manage that kind of discrete motion, you need an alternative way to do that, or you need to be able to turn that kind of functionality off. And the last one, 413, status messages. In content implemented using markup languages, status messages can be programmatically determined without requiring the user or without to move focus to that thing or without programmatically moving focus to that status message. And so I'm going to quickly try a little demo here. And of course, we know that these almost never work.
VoiceOver on Safari. Loading progress indicator demo. Window. Loading progress indicator. Load a new component button.
So I'm going to press this. It's going to start loading a new component. We're going to get a visual status message. But focus is not going to move from the load a new component button, but we're going to get that status message anyway. Fingers crossed, right?
Relax while we load a new component for you.
So usually those sorts of Those sorts of simple things are not provided. And so what happens with blind users is they sit there wondering if anything's happening at all. And if the thing's taking 10, 15, 20 seconds to load, you need to know that something is going on, because otherwise you try to do it again or intervene somehow, right?
Component. Finder. Cup finder. Desktop. F5. Button. F5. Button. VoiceOver off.
So start now, it's backwards compatible. If you meet 2.1, you meet 2.0, but this way you get to serve so many more of your customers and users, people using touch interfaces, small devices, voice recognition, people with low vision or intellectual or learning or reading disabilities. And as our populations get older, those numbers are only increasing, right? So no time for questions, evidently, but thanks very much. I hope there was something in there for you.
Alicamp, October 2018.